RL7 Point of View is meant to help us determine how who is telling the story and how they are telling it influences the credibility of the story. And while the applications here are to fictional texts, I think this is a really good skill to have throughout all of life, because you're always going to encounter people who have things to tell you, and knowing whether or not they're accurate is a really good skill to have in your back pocket. This particular target asks that you can analyze a point of view which requires distinguishing what is directly stated in a text from what is really meant. And some examples here would be satire, irony, sarcasm, understatement. These different types of figurative language and of hidden meaning are actually very popular in today's media, so you're going to find that they're quite familiar to you. The key here is understanding that things are not always as they seem and getting to the heart of the matter. At the 4 level, we are adding in the qualifier that there's little information given. So it's not going to be obvious that there's a hidden meaning. You will need to determine that based on what you know about the narrator and what you have bringing to the table as far as your own background knowledge. At the 2 level, you can understand that there's a second meaning, but you may not necessarily know what it is. And at the 1 level, you can only see one meaning, and you don't understand that there is a hidden meaning at play in the text. So just to give this some perspective, right? This is a rather amusing picture. We've got a car that has clearly gone astray, and we have 5 different points of view and 5 different people who might say different things about what has happened here, right? We've got this woman here who is smiling, right? So she clearly thinks this is fairly amusing. Perhaps this is just something that she happened upon. Maybe it's her yacht, and she can't think of anything better to do but laugh at this point. We've got 3 people here who are observers. Maybe they're just in shock. And then I added this arrow. You know, we can assume that perhaps the person who was in this car took a little swim to get to safety. Their point of view about what happened here is likely very different, and what they might say is probably going to be very different. I think we can all probably imagine that when people get into car accidents, sometimes they might try and hide their own errors. So perhaps this person who is driving might say, oh yeah, you know, the brakes went out, or I don't know what happened. The car just, you know, totally lost control, when in fact maybe they were texting and not paying attention. We try and hide the truth sometimes to save ourselves. Versus these other people, they don't really necessarily have that interest. They're more likely to give us a pretty accurate report of what's happened. In literature, we can see this in a kid's book example, right? I think we all probably know the story of the 3 little pigs, right? The big bad wolf comes, he huffs and puffs, blows down their houses, and the pigs are viewed as the sympathetic characters, the wolf is viewed as the bad guy. But there is a book called The True Story, and it's told by the wolf's point of view, and according to him, you know, he was just sick, and he was looking for a little help, and they just wouldn't help him out. And he tries to make himself look a little bit more sympathetic. Who's telling the truth? Who's not? You know, things are not black and white. You have to dig through the information present and decide who is really the more reliable narrator of your story. Why does this even matter? Narrators influence how we view the characters and events of a story. And in real life, too, how people tell us things can have a huge influence on how we perceive the people and the world around us. If you constantly surround yourself with negative people, you are more likely to view the world in a negative lens. Same thing with stories. If our narrator is telling us that, oh, the other characters are so mean to me, they're so terrible, we're likely to believe them. But that may not always be the case. The narrator, him or herself, might be the one with the problem. So we can't always trust that our narrators are being truthful. Narrators sometimes have hidden meanings and agendas, just like real people. This is just a basic flow chart of different types of point of view, and when we're talking about point of view, it's helpful to know what exactly we're working with before we get into how does hidden meaning come into play. So the first question we ask ourselves with this flow chart is the narrative first or third person? And just to review what that would mean then, first person, it would be I, me, we, us. Third person would be he, she, they. So that's a pretty quick pick when you look at the story, what is being used. If it's I, me, we, us, then it's a first-person story, but there's still more to determine, especially when it comes to credibility. The next thing we ask ourselves is a major character telling the story? If the answer is yes, then it's called major participant first person. If the answer is no, it's minor participant first person. Why does this matter? Well, as we have just discussed, sometimes characters, people, narrators will not be honest with us in an attempt to make themselves look better. And if you're dealing with a major participant, they may not want you to know that maybe they have made mistakes. They're more likely to paint a picture where they are the one who is the victim or or they're the one who is the hero, even if that's not always the case. A minor participant, someone who doesn't really have a lot at stake in the story, could be more truthful in some cases because they have no skin to lose if they look bad. They're simply reporting out on the main events and the main characters. Something to think about when you are considering first-person major versus minor point of view. If the point of view is third person, then we need to ask ourselves, do you know what the characters are thinking? And if the answer is yes, we ask, do we know what most of the characters are thinking? If the answer to that is yes, then we call that omniscient third person, all-knowing, omniscient. If the answer is no, we only know what one or two characters are thinking, we call it limited omniscient third person. Now, omniscient third person is probably the most trustworthy of any of the points of view because, in theory, this is all being told from a very subjective standpoint. We know what every character is thinking, therefore we know who is bad and who is good. So that's something to keep in mind when you're doing an analysis of point of view. Limited, if we have some hidden thoughts, then we can't necessarily trust what those characters are up to or why those characters aren't shared with us versus others. Now, if we don't know what the characters are thinking, then we have to ask ourselves, well, do we know any history or background of any of the characters? And if the answer is yes, then we call that familiar observer. And still third person. If the answer is no, it's objective observer. Okay. And of these two, if we don't know any background, we really have to make a lot of guesses as to what our characters are trying to do and how they're doing it. So that leaves a lot to the imagination. There's no interpretation on the one hand that can be good as far as determining who is good and who is bad. It's entirely up to us and our morals, but we don't get a lot of information to work with. Familiar observer, we at least get a little bit more information to work with in making that determination. Now, as far as hidden point of view goes, there are a few techniques that are in particular used frequently to help hide point of view. And as I mentioned earlier, these are very common in modern media, so you're going to find that they're very familiar to you. Understatement is where a writer or speaker deliberately makes a situation seem less important or serious than it is. This is the most common way to get yourself out of trouble, right? An example, this is a slight problem when the entire building caves in from a bad storm. Or you've gotten into a car accident and you might say, well, there's a little damage to the car when your car is totaled. Or, yeah, I maybe wasn't paying as much attention as I should have been, when in fact you were totally not paying attention at all. These are all examples of understatement. And it's very common. Irony, also very common. It's the use of words to convey a meaning that is the opposite of the actual meaning, the literal meaning, or an outcome of events exactly opposite to what was expected. The key with irony is that it must be opposite, okay? Example, the irony of a reply, how nice, when I said I had to work all weekend. It is in fact not nice at all. It's the opposite of nice, and so how nice becomes an ironic response. An event one, marriage is an institution built on love, yet it often ends in hate, the exact opposite, an unfortunate truth in our world today. Sarcasm is probably what you are most familiar with, and sarcasm uses irony. It's a sharp cutting and or mocking remark, so this is a comment that's meant to hurt, quite frankly, that again uses irony, so uses an opposite. So as an example, saying to someone, you're so intelligent, when they've just made a mistake, and they've clearly shown that they maybe weren't as intelligent as they thought. But again, the key here is an opposite, and sarcasm is differentiated from irony because it's intended to hurt someone. Now we're going to take a look at our poem that we've been working with for all of the literature targets here, Wilfred Owen's Dulce et Decorum Est. And the first thing we're going to do is determine what point of view is being used. We'll talk about how that might influence our understanding of the story, and then you can see I've already made note of some of that hidden meaning here too, because I think it's incredibly important to our understanding of this poem as a whole. So the poem goes as follows. Bent double like old beggars under sacks, knock-kneed, coughing like hags, we cursed through sludge, till on the haunting flares we turned our backs, and toward our distant rest began to trudge. Men marched asleep. Many had lost their boots, but limped on, bloodshod. All went lame, all blind, drunk with fatigue, deaf even to the hoots of tired, outstripped 5-9s that dropped behind. Gas, gas, quick, boys! An ecstasy of fumbling, fitting the clumsy helmets just in time. But someone still was yelling out and stumbling and floundering like a man in fire or lime. Dim through the misty panes and thick green light as under a green sea, I saw him drowning. In all my dreams, before my helpless sight, he plunges at me, guttering, choking, drowning. If in some smothering dreams you too could pace behind the wagon that we flung him in, and watch the white eyes writhing in his hanging face like a devil's, sick of sin, if you could hear at every jolt the blood come gargling from the froth-corrupted lungs, obscene as cancer, bitter as the cut of vile, incurable sores on innocent tongues, my friend, you would not tell with such high zest to children ardent for some desperate glory the old lie, dulce et decorum est pro patria more. Okay, so basic point of view here. We clearly have I saw him, he plunges at me. So we know it is first person. And then we need to ask, is this a major or minor character? And, I mean, the characters that play in this particular poem are all soldiers, but this is one soldier's perspective and memory of what happened. So I think it's safe to say that this is a major participant. This is what he witnessed. And so then we need to ask, well, is this major participant telling us the truth? Does he have any skin in the game? Is there anything that he could stand to lose by revealing the truth? And I think it's safe to say that many soldiers don't like to talk about their experiences at war. They don't like to talk about the horrors that they saw because maybe they don't want to relive them or they don't want to look weak. I think the fact that this narrator is telling us about the awful experience that he had would actually suggest that he is being more honest than most. He's willing to admit what happened to him and how much of an impact it had. So in that sense, I would say this is probably a good example of a trustworthy first-person narration. He is putting everything on the line and telling us the truth. And he is using some hidden meaning here. We've got some clear irony going on. The closing section of this poem highlights the irony of war. It's neither honorable nor right to die in the manner described, which relates into that last line. The old lie, dulce et decorum est pro patria more, and to die, it's honorable and right to die for your country. Well, this entire poem really tells us that this is not the case. There's nothing honorable in how this man died. There's nothing right in how he died. And while perhaps we could say that that was a true statement in years when war was not waged in such a manufactured way, it certainly isn't when you're dying and you can't even see the enemy coming. There's nothing honorable about that. So for this particular piece, some irony, a trustworthy narrator, and that would be how we can take a look at point of view and determine how it impacts the story.